This week I have a zombie story for you. In fact, this story is based on an allegedly true story that I read when I was 11 years old in 1985. I remember that I was exactly 11 because my teacher at school asked us all to write a story, and I wrote my own version of this zombie story. Unfortunately, I don't remember in which book I originally read it, and whether it was even intended for adults or children. But what I do remember was that the story was claimed to be a true story, and I don't even remember where it was set, but I think it was somewhere in an English woodland. I'm not going to say any more than that right now because I don't want to spoil the story, but at the end I'll tell you which elements of my fictional story are derived from the original, supposedly true story. You probably won't know this, but since 1975, the British government has employed a single plane to continually crisscross the country, monitoring radiation levels. The idea is that if, for example, some terrorist organisation attempts to stockpile radioactive material, or even if a radioactive source goes missing from hospital radiotherapy equipment, there is a fair chance that the plane will detect it before too much harm is done. Officially, this plane does not exist, but it has become a secret very poorly kept in certain circles. In 1983, an anomaly was detected above a woods near the village of Bromwell, North Yorkshire. The responsibility of going and checking it out fell to me as a junior technician specialising in radiation hazards attached to the Environmental Protection Agency. Bromwell turned out to be nothing special. In fact, it was nearly a carbon copy of the town I had grown up in. There were a few dozen shops, a town hall, and several depressing nightclubs that I could well imagine attracted a lot of tough, bald-headed men and underdressed young women. An abandoned railway line led out of the town and was by then used as an informal public footpath, although the old tracks and sleepers still remained, but tremendously overgrown with weeds. These old tracks led to the private woodland that I was sent to investigate. I managed to get lost several times on the way to Bromwell, so it was already almost evening by the time I started out towards the woods. It's important to understand that most of the time these anomalies turned out to be literally nothing, a random burst of cosmic rays or a temporary malfunction of the machine. Even a good dose of static electricity could set the sensors off. I've heard that sometimes distant lightning even set the detector off, for reasons that are unclear. In spite of the obvious steady economic decline of the town, the Bromwell locals seemed to be pretty friendly, and I was in reasonably good spirits as I marched along whistling to myself by the side of the rail track. There was no reason to think that anything bad was going to happen. Some people have since suggested that I experienced a hallucination caused by anxiety over the possible orphan radiation source. But I didn't really feel any such anxiety, and that's the truth. Besides, that could hardly explain what subsequently happened to Johnson, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My expectation was that I would go for a nice walk in the woods, maybe see a fox or a squirrel, or hear a cuckoo if I was lucky. Then I'd return to my car and that would be that. Worst case, I'd end up covered in mud up to my knees, and I'd discover someone had smashed up an old radiotherapy unit in the woods and would have to inform the landowner and get specialists up from Manchester to sort it out. Eventually the track led under a bridge on top of which was a local bypass of recent construction. Then some narrow steps led up to a footpath by the side of farmers' fields. I walked past 2 fields, then hopped over a fence into the woods, ignoring the private no trespassers signs. The wood was rather pretty with trees at least a century in age. Narrow overgrown paths led off between the trees and the shrubs. I took the Geiger counter out of its bag and held it out in front of me as I marched off into the depths of the forest, if you can call it a forest, considering it spanned only 4 square miles. The reading was completely normal. I measured only typical background radiation. The only weird thing, and it was very weird, was that the forest was completely silent apart from the noise of the wind. I could not hear so much as a single crow or starling. As I got deeper into the trees, I cursed myself for not setting off earlier. Above the open fields, the sky was grey, but it was definitely still daytime. In among the trees, it seemed preternaturally dark. I began to get a bad case of the shivers. There was something unnerving about the darkness and silence. I had no map of the woodland paths, and I was relying on the small size of it to avoid getting lost. At worst, it was necessary only to walk for a mile or so in any direction, and I'd soon be back in the fields, and from there I could trace the edges of fields till I hit a road. After 15 minutes of walking at as brisk a pace as the weeds growing over the path would allow, I judged myself to be more or less in the centre of the thing, and still the meter hadn't budged off background. I decided to investigate a little side path just to see where it went, but after 5 minutes it petered out, having gone nowhere. When I tried to retrace my steps to the main path, I must have turned down some previously unnoticed side path off the side path, because I quickly realised that I had got completely lost. Even so, and notwithstanding the incipient darkness and the eerie silence, I've always said it's impossible to get lost in 4 square miles, so I wasn't worried. I was only slightly unnerved. Eventually the track, which was now far more overgrown with weeds than previously, and at times threatened to disappear altogether, emerged into a small clearing, and I sat down on a fallen tree, feeling in need of a rest from constantly batting away brambles and nettles. I put the Geiger counter on the grass next to me, where it continued its steady ticking. In my backpack I had a map which at least showed the surrounding roads, and I took it out, unfolded it, and tried to imagine where I might be. Annoyingly, I had not brought a compass and I couldn't tell where the sun was setting, and I'd lost track of my direction. It was then that my attention was caught by a faint, distant sound, all the more striking because of the otherwise pervasive silence. It was the sound of something big smashing through branches and shrubbery, apparently making its way through the forest without regard to footpaths and trails, carelessly smashing everything in its way. I couldn't imagine what sort of a thing would do that in such a place as Yorkshire. In the forests of France or Spain, one might encounter wild boar or even small bears, but I've never heard of boar in Yorkshire, and there are certainly no bears in the area, nor anywhere on the island of Great Britain, as far as I was aware. I was idly wondering if a horse or a cow might have got lost, when the Geiger counter caught my attention. It was, quite definitely, reading well above background. I've mentioned that I already felt unnerved by the dim light and the silence, and now my hair positively stood on end. The counter hadn't read anything unusual when I sat down, I was sure of it. Sometimes a stray burst of cosmic rays or some passing military vehicle might cause a brief uptick, but a sustained high reading is quite unusual. It was reading at least 50% above background. That suggested a source actually on the move and moving towards me. The crashing sounds were growing gradually louder, and I realised with a start that the radiation level was increasing correspondingly. Unless you're British, you might not be aware of exactly how tame Britain actually is. We have no wolves or bears or tigers. We have only one type of poisonous snake, and few people have ever even seen one, since it's somewhat rare and afraid of humans. We have no earthquakes, nor hurricanes of the type that can do anything worse than knock an occasional tree over. And yet, there I was, lost in a forest with, apparently, a radioactive bear making straight for me, thundering through the undergrowth. As the crashing grew louder, the discreet clicks of the meter began to blend into an undifferentiated scream, as if I'd stuck the thing next to a block of uranium, and I jumped to my feet, filled with adrenaline, preparing to run. Then, just as I was expecting something to emerge into the clearing, the noise of breaking branches stopped. The counter was positively wailing. I watched the trees breathlessly at the spot where I thought the thing might appear. I could see nothing out of the ordinary. "Who's there?" I shouted. I didn't really expect a reply, but I half fancied I did hear something, a sound that was a sort of half groan, half raspy exhalation. My heart was pounding and my palms wet. I had no way to defend myself if there was indeed some sort of dangerous wild animal loose in the woods. Then the smashing, snapping sounds resumed. The pitch of the Geiger counter turned to a scream, and a thing emerged from the trees in front of me. It was clearly human and wore what looked like a military uniform, immensely old, filthy and tattered. But what really terrified me was its head. The entire head was weaving eerily from side to side, the neck apparently broken, as if connected to the torso only by thin sheets of skin and flesh, incapable of making it stand upright, but sufficient to make it sway and roll horribly on what remained of the neck. The face itself was in an advanced state of decomposition, flies buzzing hungrily around empty eye sockets, black and yellow teeth exposed by rotted lips. The nose too had rotted half away, and what skin remained was grey in colour. For a few moments I was rooted to the spot, frozen in horror, during which time the thing continued to stumble towards me with a stiff, lumbering gait. Perhaps only the wailing of the Geiger counter snapped me out of it. Snatching the counter in one hand and my rucksack in the other, I turned and fled from the clearing. I had seen more than enough. I ran blindly down one nearly impassable rabbit track after another, caring only to get as far away from possible as that thing, as fast as my legs would carry me. When the path turned into a nearly impassable thicket of brambles, I paused only to listen and to see if I could hear anything of the creature's progress. But I heard nothing, and the Geiger counter showed only a slightly elevated reading. Still, that elevated reading was enough to make me practically fling myself into the briars. Perhaps 10 minutes later, I emerged at the edge of a field with an enormous sense of relief, bleeding and bruised, but far away from that dreadful apparition. The sky was so grey that I couldn't tell in which part of the sky the sun was setting, only that it was almost dark. In Britain, this is a state of affairs that is entirely typical. Actually, it took me longer than I expected to reach a road, since I didn't know in what direction I should best head. When I finally found one, it was more or less dark. I walked till I came upon a pub that was marked on the map, and from there I was back at my car in another 20 minutes. My state of mind was so out of sorts that it was only as I tried vainly to sleep later that night back at home in my own familiar bed that I realised the whole affair had left me with a big problem. I had verified that there was indeed something highly radioactive in that wood, but the only report I could make of it involved the supernatural. No human being of ordinary flesh and blood could possibly lumber about like that, however crudely, with a decomposing head. The proper thing to do was to go back to the woodland and verify my findings. After an hour of sleepless worrying, I resolved quite firmly never to go near that place again. No one could force me to go back, not even under threat of losing my position at the Environmental Protection Agency. The following day, I wrote a report for my boss, keeping it as vague as possible. Around 3 in the afternoon, he called me to his office, and when I got there, Peter Johnson was sitting there. In view of subsequent events, I'll not speak ill of Peter. He and I simply didn't get on, and that's all that needs saying. Even so, he had never given me any reason to doubt his competency and professionalism. My boss, who liked to be known as Des, motioned me to sit down. "Ray," he said to me, "how long have you worked here?" "I believe it's 5 years next month," I said. "5 years," said Des. "And you think this is acceptable?" He held up my report. "I had a bit of a fright," I said. "You had a bit of a fright," said Des, dryly. Peter broke into laughter. "So what is it, Ray?" said Des. "A bear? A massive wolf? A rhinoceros? You say here only, I quote, some kind of large animal. I don't expect or require that my staff be zoologists, but surely you could at least give us more than this." "I didn't get much of a look at it," I replied. "It was almost dark." "Well, look," said Des, "I'm bringing Peter in on this, and I want you to work with him and track this thing down. Take a marksman with you if necessary. We can't have radioactive—" He paused. "Beasts roaming about in rural Yorkshire woodlands, can we?" "Certainly not," I replied. Peter burst into laughter again. After that, I had no choice but to tell Peter exactly what I had seen, adding on a polite request that he not relay this information to Des, since it undoubtedly made me look like a madman. "So what are you saying?" said Pete, as we discussed the whole thing in the kitchen later on. "There's some radioactive nutter hanging about in them woods." "Pete, its face was rotting," I said. "It could not have been alive." "Clearly it was alive, you idiot, or it wouldn't have been walking about," he said. "What if it needs medical assistance? Haven't you thought of that? It could have been someone who's had a bad accident." "I'm telling you, its neck was completely broken," I said. "It was a corpse. How it was walking, I don't know." "Then it's a prank," said Pete. "Someone's playing a joke. If it's radioactive, that's not the type of joke that we at the Environmental Protection Agency can allow. Potentially this is a police matter. You need to go back and have a proper look at it. During the day, not when it's half dark. Honestly, Ray, sometimes I despair of you. Most of your work's okay, but then once every few months you do something absolutely bonkers." "I'm not going back there," I said. "You have to," he said. "I'm not," I said. "Des can fire me for all I care. I never want to see that thing again." Peter sighed heavily. "You bloody lunatic," he said. "Then I'll go. And pretty stupid you'll look when it turns out some poor shocker needed an ambulance and you left him in the woods and ran off like a child because you had a fright." Pete could say what he liked. If he was prepared to go and look for himself after what I'd told him, my attitude was that he might as well get on with it. In fact, I felt quite grateful to him. Pete set out for Bromwell the very next day, with careful written instructions from myself. By 8 p.m. he should have returned, but we still hadn't heard from him. No phone call and no sight of him. I was still at the office waiting for his call and completing some unrelated paperwork. At 8:30 p.m. his wife called and I had to tell her he wasn't back yet. I waited till 2 in the morning. I had an awful presentiment that something was very wrong. I knew I should have really gone with him, if not in his place, and I was feeling distinctly guilty. His wife seemed calmer than I, knowing nothing of the peculiar circumstances of his field trip, and when I called her about 2:30, I think I woke her up. She told me Pete quite often books rooms in hotels in preference to facing a long drive in the evening, and that I shouldn't worry. When Pete still hadn't turned up the following morning, I had no choice but to inform the police. They said they would take no action till 24 hours had passed, since, after all, Pete was an adult, and it wasn't as if he'd got lost on the moors in winter. By noon, my conscience was bothering me enough to raise an idea with Des. I'd given Pete exact instructions for finding the woods, including a note of the best place to park, and I suggested I go and see if his car was parked there. If it was, he must still be in the wood and must have broken his leg or something. Des thought that a good idea, and I set off immediately. By early afternoon, I arrived at the parking spot, having managed not to get lost even once, and my heart sank. Pete's car was indeed parked there, and there was no sign of Pete. I drove about a mile to the nearest phone box to put in a call to Des. He told me he'd informed the police and asked me to wait. After a quarter of an hour or so, the phone rang and Des informed me search and rescue were on their way, exactly as if he'd got lost in the Cairngorms. It would have been funny under other circumstances. It took them an hour to arrive, during which time I hung around the phone box. A man and a woman turned up, resplendent in fluorescent green equipment. It seemed like overkill for a small woodlands, but I suppose that's just what they normally wore. They insisted I accompany them, since obviously they didn't know the way. Although I didn't want to return to the forest, There's bravery in numbers, and I didn't have much choice. I was relieved to see that they had at least brought a rifle with them. When we got there, we were met by the same eerie silence as previously. "Bit quiet, isn't it?" said the woman chirpily. "Fur gives me the creeps," said the man. We walked along the wide path that goes right through the middle of the thing, my Geiger counter ticking away as we went. They had plenty of questions for me, and I answered them frankly, except for the part about the dead man with the broken neck. I said only that I'd seen some vague shape in the darkness. The woman suggested it might have been a large stray dog, and I was only too happy to agree. When we arrived at the side trail, I pointed it out, and a man said perhaps we should check it to see if Pete had gone up there. The hairs were rising on my neck, but I didn't see how the creature could hurt 3 people with a rifle, so I steeled my nerves. We had only gone a couple of minutes up the path when I noticed a distinct uptick on the Geiger counter. It was slight, and that type of thing can easily happen due to the presence of trace amounts of uranium in the rocks. By itself it meant nothing. But then I thought I heard something. "Wait a minute," I said. "Listen." We stood still and strained our ears. "That sounds like something," said the woman. An unmistakable crashing sound was coming from somewhere in front of us. "Better go and have a look," said the man. We walked on towards the sound. I'm not ashamed to admit that I hung about at the back. One sight of that thing had been more than enough for me. Eventually we reached the same clearing that I had encountered previously, and the crashing and snapping noises were clearly close by. "Let's wait a minute," said the man. We stood there waiting for the thing to emerge into the clearing. The man pulled back the catch on his rifle, and then, quite suddenly, it burst out from the tree line with a tremendous final crash as it smashed its way through the bushes. It was covered in blood and scratches, and it was half crying, half laughing. The thing we saw before us was none other than Pete. He ran at the closest person, which happened to be the bemused search and rescue woman, and flung his arms around her, gibbering something about an awful smell of decaying meat. We were never able to discover what had happened to Pete. We took him straight to a hospital, but after brief treatment for dehydration, he was quickly transferred to a psychiatric ward. The poor fellow's mind had quite gone, and it's not since shown any sign of improvement. His wife visited him daily at first, and then weekly, but after a year she could bear it no longer, and I don't think she's seen him since she filed for divorce. I went to see him a couple of times myself, but I don't think he was aware of my presence. He only rocked back and forth on the floor, agitated, despite the vast quantities of tranquilizers they had him on, moaning something about rotting eye sockets. Pete's Geiger counter did reveal something curious, however. It was an advanced American model, set to create an internal log, which could be read by a computer. The log showed that Pete had encountered a radioactive source and had remained in close proximity with it for over an hour. The intensity was about 1,000 times that of background, not enough to cause radiation sickness, but certainly quite remarkable. Due to this finding, a team was assembled to scour the woodlands. I was not a member of it. In fact, I transferred to a different department at the agency in a different county quite soon afterwards. I heard that the team reported distant crashing sounds, like a large animal smashing through the tree branches and shrubs, but they were never able to find anything radioactive in there, nor did they encounter anything else out of the ordinary. Out of curiosity, I tried to discover something of the history of the woods, wondering if anything out of the ordinary had happened there. And it was in an old book of local history in Bromwell Library, clearly well thumbed and falling apart at the seams, that I found the strange tale of the German plane crash. During the Second World War, a German bomber had apparently downed in the middle of the woodlands somewhere. When the wreckage was examined, the pilot was nowhere to be seen, and it was assumed that he was legging it across the countryside on his way back to Germany, having bailed out by parachute. No trace of him was ever discovered. It was unclear why the plane had crashed. There wasn't anything obviously wrong with it, aside from the damage done by crashing into the trees. In the wreckage, a canister was discovered that contained odd silvery granules. These ended up spending the night in some farmer's cottage while he made inquiries about where to send them, and within 3 weeks, he and his wife had both died of unknown causes, leaving 2 children without parents. The author linked all this to a rumoured Nazi programme to tag Britain with radioactive sources based on a modified grid pattern. The idea was to apparently drop radioactive granules in certain key locations where they would be unlikely to be uncovered. This would allow German bombers to determine their positions even during blackouts. These would have been very high-risk missions for the pilots, since they would have had to fly during the day in order to accurately position themselves, and would have been exposed to significant doses of ionizing radiation. Perhaps Pete was right. Someone played some sort of prank on us. Someone read the account of the missing Nazi bomber and decided to somehow fake a radioactive Nazi zombie. If this was indeed the case, the fake zombie was extraordinarily convincing enough to send Pete clean off his rocker and to give me awful nightmares for years to come. And how would that person have known that anyone would even be in the forest at those particular dates and times to witness their twisted creation? But the alternative explanation is too horrible to contemplate. A gravely injured German pilot, somehow preserved in a state halfway between life and death by nuclear radiation, still roaming about the woods decades later? No, that idea I prefer not to think about. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to Science Horror, and my name is John Purcell. All the stories on this channel are written by me. Now, I said at the start that this story was based on an original supposedly true story, and that true story basically said only that someone had gone into a woodlands and the woodland had gone suddenly extremely quiet, so they couldn't hear any birds or anything, and then they heard this crashing sound and this zombie appeared in front of them. I remember the story describing its head as bobbing uncannily from side to side, and it was wearing old rags for clothes, and its face was decomposing. I think it mentioned yellowish skin, in fact. Apart from that, I can't remember anything of it, and it wasn't a long story, it was just a short account of something that had apparently supposedly happened. And the story said that other people had heard these crashing sounds in the forest, but I don't think anyone else had seen the zombie, which kind of makes me think maybe it was just some hallucination or someone just made up a story. Anyway, if you enjoyed this story, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leave a comment if you feel like it. Comments, likes and subscriptions are very much appreciated. Thank you very much. Next week I'm probably going to read a story that I still have to finish, but it's about a university student who kind of falls into the grip of a professor who does horrific brain experiments on him. But if, like me, you're not too keen on actual gore, then don't worry, there's no actual invasive brain surgery, it's all to do with magnetic fields. Do join me again next week for that, and until then, have a good week and sleep well.